You know, a lot of these countries have no or almost no capacity in terms of creating functional criminal justice systems. They don't have people trained in evidence collection. They don't have systems to protect the evidence. They don't know how to work with the evidence. I mean, I would venture to say that probably three-quarters of the world is in this situation.
In terms of having the laws, yes, we do have all the laws. But in terms of application, well, that is a problem as much as everywhere, but worse here.
Well, they generally, I think I would have to say it relates to resources. Sometimes the absence of technical equipment inhibits the efficient investigation of cases.
The equipment was very, very poor quality, and they did not have a complete understanding of how to properly collect physical evidence and what to do with it once they collected it.
We had the support of various people in the Ethiopian justice system. We had excellent Canadian experts who were able to help us develop the material. We had all our supplies and equipment for the crime scene course, and then we faced our biggest challenge.
In May of 2011, 5 Canadians traveled from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, to Ethiopia to implement a groundbreaking training in crime scene investigation for police and prosecutors. The challenges faced in implementing that training were monumental and unexpected. Even more unexpected, the small non-profit organization that facilitated this training was born in the 1980s in Vancouver with an original mandate far less ambitious than bringing about change to a justice system on the other side of the world.
And so when the new courthouse opened in 1979, we had a two-person program, which was Rick Craig and Randy Noonan. And I remember that Mr. Justice Fulton said, we need people to act as docents. Well, I'd never heard the word in my life, but he was a Rhodes Scholar, of course, and he knew that docents are people who show tour groups around museums and art galleries. And that was the sort of thought that was the genesis of what's now the Justice Education Society.
And it actually started with the creation of the big law courts complex by Arthur Erickson in 1979. I was hired at that time, and they said, look, at the whole philosophy of the law courts complex downtown is to be open to the public. It's accessible justice, and it's got a big great hall, and the hall is filled with plants and light, and the idea was that, you know, we need to move away from a justice system that's very perceived as rigid and inflexible, and something that's more community and more open and more accessible. And so as part of that, they thought, well, you know, with a facility like that, there really should be programs of public education created. And so it was actually the building and the opportunities provided by the building that created the original program. So we had to develop resources for teachers to use in the classroom before they came to the courts. We had to then organize access programs so they could come to the courts, they'd get orientations, they'd do court watching, they'd meet with system personnel. And then the third component in the early days was the development of mock trials. And then we would organize the courts to be open for use. So we started originally with the high schools, and we would open up the courts in the evenings for 3 hours, because, you know, if they could come into a real courtroom, and we would borrow judges' robes, and we'd get robes from the court clerks, and we got sheriff uniforms, so they could actually go into it in the way. And of course, that became very popular. That was becoming the highlight of law in the school.
Amazingly, led in the end to people from other countries asking the society to assist them in establishing similar operations in their jurisdictions. You can see how far this was from the original idea of the docent showing tour groups around the courthouse, that now the society was involved in a big way in educating the public and in the end internationally around the world.
And we started to create the first project, and it was around a partnership with victim services here, which was part of the neatness of our relationships, is that we could partner with them, and we worked with the prosecutors in South Africa on the creation of a program around domestic violence. Because of course, what was clear after the Mandela came to power was, you don't, just because apartheid's over, it means the violence isn't going to stop. I mean, you've had communities grown up on violence, and the violence has been part of the culture of resistance. And the consequence on the negative side, of course, there was a lot of violence around women. I mean, we were dealing with, in South Africa in those days, rape of a woman every 4 or 5 minutes. And I mean, you just because the old regime is gone and the new regime is in, doesn't mean that all of a sudden your problems are over. There's a whole culture that had to be addressed. And so they asked us to help them work with the prosecutors and the judiciary and the victim services to create an integrated program around dealing with victims of violence. It's a long story, actually, how we started to work around criminal justice system building, but it started in Guatemala because in Central America, they were throwing out the old justice systems. Part of the peace process, after all these years of conflict in Latin America, was to say that the old inquisitorial system did not work. And we were looking at what can we do to help this process of helping to create a more effective justice system. And what came out of that was they'd asked us to do a training program for prosecutors on oral trials. We did that, but then it became clear to us that, look, this makes no sense. How can we train prosecutors on oral trial techniques if they have no evidence? And we did a study. We went around. We were looking at how do they process murder scenes, and we'd go into the second largest city in the country. They said, "What do you got for tools?" They show us a toolkit. It was a box like a toolbox about this big, and there was a set of pliers in it. They had nothing.
The multi-level justice education work of the Justice Education Society has been exported internationally to countries around the world, including South Africa, Central America, and more recently Mexico, Vietnam, and Ethiopia.
In 2008, the Society was working quite a bit in Central America, in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, around dealing with the impact of violent crime. And we thought that it would be very interesting to apply to CEDA for funding to look at the development of a program that would not only address violent crime in Central America, but domestic violence and violent crime against women in Ethiopia as well. In Central America, we're dealing with 3 countries with the highest crime rates in the world. That isn't the issue in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, one of the greatest challenges they face is the degree of violent crime against women.
The second most populous country in sub-Saharan Africa with 85 million people, Ethiopia was selected by CEDA in 2009 as a country of focus. Canada is one of Ethiopia's largest bilateral donors, and the projects in Ethiopia are but one of a number of initiatives that CEDA has implemented worldwide aimed at addressing the issue of gender-based violence. For its part, the Ethiopian government and federal police force supported the JES proposal in principle because it created the opportunity to foster the mandate of the BPR, the Business Process Reengineering, which created governmental efficiency by involving both the police and the prosecutors in the crime scene investigation process.
It used to be that we just used to sit in our offices and the detectives would conduct their investigations on their own in the manner they see fit. And when they finally become convinced that they're done investigating, they would bring it to our offices, and after that we would read into the case.
And basically we wanted to implement the justice machinery to be as fast as it can. There has been many delays in the justice machinery, so we want to be accessible for the public, and we want to make our justice system to go as smooth as possible, friendly with the human rights protections, which our country has been for many years been criticized. So we want to improve that capacities, and for that we need to come up with a coordinated mechanism between all the justice stakeholders, the police, the prisons, the attorneys, prosecutors, and the judges.
The Building Effective Justice System project in Ethiopia began by us developing a Canadian team of experts who would help us build a curriculum for our Phase 1, and Phase 1 was crime scene examination. We needed forensic experts, but also experts who could teach in Ethiopia. Once we had our Canadian experts to do the crime scene part, that was one thing, but we needed to include a gender component to the training because Ethiopia faces some of the worst violence against women in the world, and we knew that the focus of our training needed to not only be crime scene examination, but also how do you investigate properly crimes of violence against women.
WHO study focused on one area, one province in Ethiopia, but their finding was alarming. From all the countries that were researched in that report, Ethiopia stood like the highest, where the violence was very prevalent, and it was like 71% of the women said that they've been abused within the last year and several times. And the DHS study focused on the behavior of women and men, and they asked questions, 5 questions, and they asked like, which one is justifiable for a man to hit a woman, his wife? And many people agreed that he has reasons, one way or the other, and these reasons are justifiable.
In domestic cases of domestic violence, because women had to largely depend on their husbands for economic reasons. Whatever domestic violence she faces, she might be forced to keep that for herself. It's normally difficult for a woman living in a rural area to go and complain about the assault she received from a husband. One is because of economic dependency, and the second is because how the community will look at that offense. Will it really be considered an offense by the community? Maybe not. So how is she going to face up the community after complaining of an assault which the community does not accept it to be an assault?
We were very lucky and fortunate that the Vancouver Police Department was willing to partner with us. They released one of their experts from their criminal harassment unit that deals with violent crimes against women, and Keith Dorman joined the team.
So the Domestic Violence and Criminal Harassment Unit with the V2PD is a unit where the focus is on domestic violence, so violence against women, and stalking or criminal harassment.
The way the Justice Education International Program works is this. We know that Canadians have good best practices that use international standards, but when you take a Canadian curriculum to another country, you need to take into account what issues, challenges that the local country is facing and make sure that the curriculum addresses those things. And we call that tropicalizing. We basically take a Canadian curriculum and tropicalize it for use in other countries. The needs assessment is always the first step in the work that we do to assess really what the situation is in the country that we're working in. So for instance, we talk to the police, we talk to the crime scene investigators, we find out what training is currently going on, we find out what the needs are in terms of equipment, and we start to develop a plan based on what their needs are. It also provides us with a baseline of the situation the way it is so that we can evaluate it later on to see if we've actually made any impact.
We met with numerous people, as well as we had the opportunity to attend to a regional police station in Addis Ababa, which is the capital of Ethiopia. When we reviewed some files at a regional police station, there did not appear to be any collection, especially in regards to footwear collection or tire print collection. There was some fingerprint collection being done, but it was being done in a very poor manner. How they retained it and how it was recorded would be very, very difficult to present to a court. After compiling the information from both the federal and the regional police, as well as the people from the justice system, we felt that they definitely required more training in this regard, and there was definitely a very much a need for new equipment and better equipment.
በሀገራችን ፖሊስ ዋናው ስራችን በሚቀጥሉት 5 ዓመታት የሀገራችንን ፖሊስ በሙያ ብቃት ያለው ፖሊስ ተቋም መፍጠር ነው በክልልም በፌደራልም። ይህን ለማሳካት በተቋማችን ከምናደርገው ጥረት መንግስታችን ከሚያደርገው ጥረት ጎን ለጎን ሌሎች በዚህ ስራ ላይ የሚያግዙንን መንግስታዊና መንግስታዊ ያልሆኑ ድርጅቶችና ሀገራት በሰፊው የተጠቀምን ይህንን ወደፊት ያለውን ቪዥናችንን ለማሳካት ከፍተኛ ጥረት እያደረግን እንገኛለን።
One of the challenges I knew we were up against was the fact that we were trying to do training on gender violence as part of our course. And Ethiopia has some of the highest rates of violence against women in the world. And those attitudes and values are held by all members of the community. In fact, in 2007, when we were supporting another organization doing training on their domestic violence legislation that was newly introduced, we had just had a session on defining what domestic violence was. And one of the police officers, who was in middle management, came back from lunch and said, I called my wife at lunch to apologize because I didn't realize a lot of my behavior had been illegal.
የኛ ባህል በራሱ ማለት ነው ያለው ነገር ለመቀነስ ሁለት ነገር ነው። በዚህ በኩል ህግ የህግ አስተሳሰብ አለ፣ በዚህ በኩል ደግሞ የኛ የህብረተሰባችን ክፍል አስተሳሰብ አለ። ከዚህ ጋር በተያያዘ እኔ ሚስቴን ካልመጣኋት እሷ የማትረካበት ሁኔታ በጣም አይወደኝም ብላ የምትልበት ሁኔታ ነው ያለው። ህግ ደግሞ መምታት አይደለም መንካት ክልክል ነው እያለ ነው። ከዚህ ጋር በተያያዘ ህግና የህብረተሰቡ አመለካከት አልተገናኘም። እንደዚህ አይነት ነገሮችን እንዳይቀንስ ካደረጉ ነገሮች አንዱ ይሄ ነው። አንድ ምሳሌ ልናገር።
The system, the justice system faces several challenges in handling cases that come to them in regards to evidence collection and in regards to also doing the analysis afterwards. So to mention some of the issues, one is in terms of evidence, like people report cases very late. That means physical evidence may not be there. So that means they have to rely on oral evidence, circumstantial evidence, and often testimonies. We know that they could be biased or they could be manipulated in different ways. So this is primarily what happens often in cases of sexual abuse.
In order to start the project, we did a few trips to Ethiopia to talk to the different partners to get their support. And we were able to get a lot of support for the project. The police were interested, the Ministry of Justice was interested, and the courts were interested. They thought that our approach, where we were going to work with all 3 sectors, was the way to go, and it fit well within how they were looking at their justice reform internally.
The Charities and Societies Proclamation, known as the CSO Law, was enacted by the government of Ethiopia in 2009. The law prohibited foreign agencies, like Justice Education Society, from engaging in activities in Ethiopia related to justice and law enforcement, as well as human rights advocacy, including the rights of women and children. The law also specifically prohibited local Ethiopian agencies from receiving more than 10% of their funding from foreign donors. Facing these restrictions, Justice Education Society did not have the option of working with an Ethiopian non-profit organization to implement the project as it had in 2008, when it provided training to combat domestic violence. Bound and determined to move forward with training that the Ethiopian Police, prosecutors, and court system needed and desperately wanted, JES concluded that if the government didn't want foreign agencies working with Ethiopian agencies, then the solution lay in working directly with the government. After months of negotiation, finally, in August of 2009, and with considerable relief, an agreement was reached in writing with the Ethiopian Ministry of Justice to implement the Building Effective Justice Systems project. The celebration was unfortunately short-lived.
In 2009, we returned in the summer with the expectation that we could begin. And we were met with some big obstacles. We arrived in July 2009, and we received an email that night saying that the memorandum of understanding that we had gone up to the office of the Prime Minister, but because of the new CSO law, the Prime Minister's office did not give us authorization to work in Ethiopia with the Ministry of Justice. So there we were. We were in Ethiopia, but we weren't able to proceed as we had hoped. We began meeting with different people in the country to find out if there was another way for us to implement the project. We were very fortunate to meet with Pastor Daniel. He's the president of Justice for All Prison Fellowship Ethiopia, and they have special authorization to continue doing justice reform work in the country. It was a win-win. They had a mandate that was similar to ours, and they were able to implement our project, which made us which allowed us to move forward.
Justice for All Prison Fellowship Ethiopia was chartered in 1992, though it began working in Ethiopian prisons assisting prisoners. It now has a broad mandate to work in all areas and phases of the justice system, from prosecution through conclusion of prisoner incarceration. Justice for All has a goal of building the capacity of investigators, police officers, prosecutors, judges, and prison officials.
I want to say thank you very much to the Commissioner and to Pastor Daniel for welcoming us and for allowing us to support the police and prosecutors in providing this training for the next 2 weeks. We believe that justice can be achieved through knowledge. So I'm going to hand this over to the Commissioner. We had lots of challenges. We had to get equipment from Vancouver through Frankfurt to our training center, which is about 100 kilometers outside the capital, and have it arrive in time for our training. It did not. And the first day of the training went by and we had no equipment. We needed it for the second day, and about 4 o'clock on the Monday, the gate of the training center opened, and we were all very happy to see the federal police truck arrive in the compound with a truck full of our Canadian equipment.
And Richard and I spent that 2 weeks giving that course to a variety of individuals, and not all police officers. There was prosecutors. There was some with extensive crime scene experience and some with very limited. There were prosecutors that may have never gone to a crime scene, so it was all new.
The farther we get into this course, the more you are going to see the importance of physical evidence and how it is handled.
The next reason is that you don't know who has handled and who has touched the exhibits you are going to seize.
Composition of sweat, structure of the skin, which will go towards a more efficient investigations involving crimes against women. Until the present,
The objectives of the course were to develop the knowledge, skills, and abilities of the police and prosecutors to accurately record a crime scene, to examine, locate, and record physical evidence, specifically with respect to crimes of violence against women.
You receive the call. Somebody tells you to go to a crime. The first thing you do, make every effort to protect the scene.
Yes, the course progresses from stage to stage. It starts off with the basic health and safety needs that they may encounter in crime scene. It moves on to photography and basic photography skills that they're going to need.
ይህንን ዘግተን ነው እንደዚህ የምናነሳው እና አሁን ይሄኛው እንደዚህ አድርጌ ሳዘገየው ሻተሩ በጣም ሌት ሆነ።
Make sure that your flash is not hitting the steering wheel.
There, I want the light to go into that vehicle, okay? And sometimes you might be in a very small area, you may have to turn the flash this way. Imagine where the light is traveling. Okay, ready.
We then talk about fingerprints and what fingerprints are to try to make them aware of what they're going to be looking for.
But if I put up my left hand and create this pattern that makes that fingerprint unique from other people.
We move on to fingerprint and footwear development techniques and what they might find at a particular crime scene.
Now, the table is very low. If I were to roll way on an angle, I only get the tip of the finger. Okay? Much better.
We give them a number of practical scenarios so that they can actually apply those skills.
All right, go ahead. Just the ends. Very gentle. Okay? You rub the print off. Okay? With this. So very gentle.
I'm just tabbing the end. I'm using the roller. And I'm just holding it just off the glass with my fingers, allowing the roller to push it down onto the surface.
And they were taught the standard procedures which we use in Canada, which being an overall mid-range and close-up picture. They had some difficulty because they had no experience in taking what we refer to as an ACAP picture as close as possible. They were taught this method with the new equipment, which included a macro lens, and it was very successful. We also talk about plan drawings and search techniques which are necessary for major crime and have a practical example with regards to a homicide scene.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 0, 0, 0.
End of base. Number 3. Meter tape. You would take that tape, you would mark it at the end of the 30 meters.
You have the entire day in order to investigate this homicide. It is very common for Richard and I in Canada to go to a homicide scene and spend 2 or 3 days at that homicide scene. Go at this very slowly, step by step.
In the domestic violence crime scene, especially if you're going to be dealing with the victim, it's key that the victim is going to be going through a lot of emotional issues. There might be trauma, There might be, again, the barriers we talked about, the financial pieces, the dependence, and so forth. And so when you're investigating, to be aware of those things, because if you're not, it's easy to think the victim is going to be uncooperative. The victim is not interested in charges, so why should I invest in this? Why should I do the investigation? So in terms of what we tell our members too, in terms of crime scene investigation, you can have all the evidence, you can have blood, you can have footprints and so forth, but if you can't get the victim to court, if you can't support the victim, some of the times Crown is not going to pursue that situation. So you got to keep the victim on board. And so the way to keep the victim on board is when you go to the crime scene you're investigating is to be aware of what she's going through, support her by linking her up with a counselor or being, if you have those skills, talking to her, and then keep in contact with her throughout the process, and then keep in contact with the offender or somebody keep in contact with the offender so he's held accountable. So the distinction is in investigation, you got to understand where she's coming from and support her. That's the difference. Sometimes they also have medical issues, they're not well, and so it's hard to leave. Sometimes the family also says, do not leave him, there's nothing wrong, he loves you. They have children and it's very hard to leave the children behind. They need to take the children, so they stay. Or they are also been abused so many times by the husband, they believe they have no choice to leave. I would like us to break into 4 groups. Are these cases similar or different than Canadian cases that I talked about? And the third one, what challenges do you face in investigating, prosecuting crimes of violence against women? In terms of the barriers that they faced, I remember Evelyn talking about financial barriers in terms of not having a lot of resources available for the victims to support them in domestic violence. And then hearing most of the resources for victims are in Addis. And when it goes to the countryside, there's not a lot of shelters or anything else like that for the victims. So that was important information to hear. But then what we did is brainstorm with the group. Okay, if you don't have those resources available, what resources do you have available for victims? Friends, elders, educate the elders about domestic violence so the victims are supported when they go there and so forth. And so we found it was important to brainstorm in terms of what you have over there and how you can utilize it to support the victims. So we felt that was an effective piece. I think what you're indicating is at some point your government has to, and you guys as a community have to make a decision to go forward and make change.
The training of Ethiopian police and prosecutors in crime scene investigation, along with the donation of equipment, is an important start in improving the capacity of both the police and prosecutors in the investigation of crimes, particularly crimes of violence against women. However, the key to establishing real and systemic reform in the Ethiopian justice system is not only education and training, but fostering institutional change. This alone will ensure that the skills and equipment will be utilized and applied long after the Canadian trainers have left. This ultimately is the message being shared by the Justice Education Society in Ethiopia, in Central America, and countries throughout the world.
So the training that we have received here has helped us a great deal in understanding the manner of collection of evidences and to inform the police when we think that they're doing something wrong and when to acknowledge the fact that they're doing good when they're doing so. So this training has helped us understand the manner in which evidences that are brought to us are collected, and it has also helped us to gain confidence to go to the crime scene when it's necessary.
It will help a lot. Like if we, for example, take the crime scene examination training, which is being conducted now, I can see that it can make a difference in building the capacity of both investigative police officers and prosecutors in conducting proper investigations, in making sure that offenders do not escape, in making sure that any offense is not accounted for.
Each of these societies has its own context, but these sets of skills are critical on every one of them. And now we're not saying do it to the standard of Canada, they'll never, because they don't have the resources. But they can do a lot. And what we're trying to do then is take a set of processes and then what we call tropicalize them, adapt them to the context of the country, and insist that there is a capacity level they can go to. And part of this is more than training them, is to actually saying, look, training is just part of this. You have to implement this. You have to create systems. And then as part of that, we want to monitor those systems. So the framework created in Central America is the same framework that drives what's going on in Ethiopia.
ጥሩ ጥያቄ ነው። እኔም ቀድሜ ሳስብበት የነበረው ነገር ነው። የተለያየ ሀገር አሜሪካና እንግሊዝ አጋጥሞኛል። ቀጥሎ አሁን ከካናዳ ጋር አጋጥሞኛል። ማለት ማንም ይሄን ነገር አላሰበውም። ሁል ጊዜ እኛ እየመጣን መስጠት የለብንም። ራሳችሁን በራሳችሁ ማስተማር አለባችሁ። ስለዚህ እዚህ ነገር ላይ የራሳችሁን ነገር የራሳችሁን ዕውቀት ሼር አድርጋችሁ ለሌላው አካፍላችሁ ራሳችሁን በራሳችሁ ያሰለጠናችሁ የፍትህ ስርዓቱን ከማሻሻል አንፃር በራሳችሁ ብትሰሩት ጥሩ ነው በሚል ሐሳብ ይሄ ነገር መምጣቱ እጅግ በጣም የሚያስደስትና እኔ ቀድሜም ሳወራበት የነበረው ነገር ነው እና በጣም
So getting those people, the Ethiopian trainees, to become facilitators and through time to become trainers themselves will certainly ensure the transfer of knowledge from Canada to Ethiopia, and to make sure that you can actually teach as many people as you like and spread the message not only in Adama by calling people from all over the country, but you also create people who are able to come here, learn the crime scene investigation techniques and go to wherever they're working and spread the message there.
I feel that this training is going to help the police and the prosecutors understand victims of violence much better than what they used to do. Because in my previous experience in the trainings, I've seen police men and women cry and say that, you know what, I've gone through this, but I never processed it this way. And I was reflecting this on the victims. And they're overly aggressive, or they don't even understand what the women are feeling in that place. So the interviewing system and overall handling and information giving, this kind of things, and analyzing the level of threat, that was never existent in our system.
It's my hope that the legacy of the training that we're providing is that some of the individuals that we have will be able to improve the skills that they currently have, that will be able to show those skills to their co-workers and improve the overall crime scene examinations that may be taking place within Ethiopia.
I think that Canada, we have to now step back and allow the Ethiopian people to take over the project. And I think we've also got an awful lot of support, not only through the government agencies, but both the police and the prosecutors and other people involved.
Phase 1 of the training is the crime scene examination. The training was successful. We were able to have Ethiopian facilitators take over the course and train other Ethiopians all in Amharic. In fact, as we speak, there's a course going on right now in Ethiopia for members of units that deal with crimes of violence against women. We're satisfied that we were successful in implementing that. Is the project successful? Well, we'll have to see. We have 2 more phases. We need to train police and prosecutors in major case management so that they can take the physical evidence and prepare it properly for court. We need to train prosecutors and judges on dealing with physical evidence in court. If this is implemented, then yes, our project will have succeeded.
With the impetus of a new and architecturally innovative courthouse, the Justice Education Society was born in the 1980s with the vision of creating transparency and accessibility for the justice system in Vancouver, British Columbia. School programs for First Nation and immigrant groups brought citizens into the courthouse and the judiciary into the community. In time, the society changed not only its name, but its focus, as it migrated from the confines of the Vancouver courthouse to offices throughout the province of British Columbia and internationally to South Africa, Central America, Southeast Asia, and Ethiopia. After months of planning, conducting needs assessments, and negotiating with the Ethiopian Ministry of Justice, and facing the significant hurdle of the Ethiopian CSO law, by May of 2011, the Justice Education Society had found an Ethiopian partner and a way to bring a component of justice system reform to Ethiopia. The crime scene investigation training and the provision of equipment for Ethiopian police and prosecutors is but the first stage and the first small step in the long and difficult path towards building the capacity of the Ethiopian people to combat crime and in particular the endemic crimes of violence against women.
Justice had always been, in the old days, a very cloistered institution. That public really didn't want to go into the courthouse, and judges didn't want to talk to public groups because they feared that what they said would be used for mischief. And I feel that the building of this bridge between the courts and the public in this province has been a huge accomplishment for which full credit should be given to what is now the Justice Education Society, and what started in 1979 as the Public Education Project deserves great credit for having accomplished that. And Rick was convinced, I mean, this has been his message, that it could be done, and it's the greatest tribute to him and his colleagues that their work has been so received in many other countries of the world. We don't think of ourselves in BC as world leaders, but in this matter we are.